The doorbell rang at 6:30 in the evening. It was a Thursday. I was in my home office reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm. My daughter Emma was at debate practice at the high school. The house was quiet. It was the kind of peaceful quiet that I had spent over 2 decades building for myself. The chime was soft and melodic, nothing like the harsh buzzer from the apartment I grew up in. Everything in this house, from the hardwood floors to the granite countertops, was a testament to a life I had built from scratch. A life I controlled completely. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world are you watching from. I walked to the door, expecting a package delivery. I glanced at the security monitor. The screen showed 2 figures standing on my front porch. Their faces were illuminated by the warm porch light. An older man and woman. They looked familiar in a distant, unsettling way, like faces from a nightmare I thought I'd forgotten. My heart didn't skip. It didn't flutter. It just stopped for one terrible moment. A cold pause in my chest. Then it resumed, steady and strong. I opened the door. My father, Robert Chun, stood there, his posture still rigid with the same self-righteousness I remembered. He wore a polo shirt and khakis that looked freshly pressed, but somehow wrong on him. My mother, Linda, stood slightly behind him, clutching a leather handbag. Her face wore that practiced smile she saved for company, the same smile she wore when she told the neighbors I was visiting relatives. 22 years. They hadn't called. They hadn't written. They had erased me from their world, and I had made sure they stayed out of mine. Now, they were on my doorstep in Phoenix, at the home I owned, under a sky they had no business sharing with me. "Sarah," my father said. His voice was raspier than I remembered, but the tone was identical. A command, not a greeting, an expectation. "Hello, Robert," I said. My voice was level, controlled. I did not call him Dad. That word had been amputated from my vocabulary long ago. My mother stepped forward, her smile stretching wider, more desperate. "Sarah, sweetheart, it's been so long. We were in town for a conference, and we just had to see you." "I see," I said. I did not move. I did not step aside. The tile floor felt solid and cool beneath my feet. I was the barrier they had to face. I had become very good at being immovable. My father's patience, always tissue thin, began to fray. He gestured toward the house behind me. "Are you going to invite us in? We've traveled a long way. We're here to see her." I knew who he meant. I had been waiting for this day. I had prepared for it. I had built my entire adult life as a fortress against this exact moment. But knowing and living it are different things. "See who?" I asked. My voice carried genuine confusion, as if he were a lost tourist asking for directions that didn't exist. My mother's smile cracked. She glanced at my father, panic flickering in her eyes. He stepped forward. "Don't play games, Sarah. We know you have a daughter. We read the article about her scholarship. She's our granddaughter. We have a right to meet our granddaughter." A right. The word floated in the warm Arizona air between us. It was a word they had always claimed, a word they believed belonged exclusively to them. They had a right to a perfect family image. They had a right to their reputation. They had a right to remove any stain that threatened their pristine picture. I looked at my father's demanding, desperate face. I looked at my mother's trembling, artificial smile. I saw them not as the titans who had destroyed my world at 16, but as they were now. 2 small, grasping people standing on a porch, trying to claim ownership of a life they had discarded like garbage. I felt a strange calm wash over me. The final piece of the armor I had been forging for 22 years slid into place. There was no rage. There was no hurt. There was only perfect clarity. I looked them both directly in the eyes. I let the silence stretch until they began to shift uncomfortably. Then I gave them the truth. "What daughter?" I asked. The confusion on their faces was immediate and complete. My father's mouth fell open. My mother's hand flew to her chest. They had come here with a script, a plan to demand, to manipulate, to force their way back into a story they had written me out of. I had just told them they were reading the wrong book. "What are you talking about?" my father stammered, his voice rising. "Your daughter, our granddaughter. I don't have a child that belongs to you," I said. And the words were the purest, most honest things I had ever spoken. "The child you're thinking of, the one that made me a disappointment in your eyes, never existed for you. You forfeited that connection 22 years ago. You made certain of that." I stepped back and my hand found the doorknob. Their stunned faces were the last thing I saw before I closed the door, sealing out the past, and leaving them alone in the evening air. The house I grew up in was always tense. Not obviously dysfunctional, but suffocating in its perfection. My father was obsessive about order. Every surface had to be spotless. Every achievement had to be documented. The family photos displayed a model Asian American family. We were the Chens. We were successful. At 16, I understood that my primary function was not to disrupt the image. I maintained a 4.0 GPA. I was student council secretary. I was quiet, compliant, and I worked tirelessly to be the daughter they demanded. But in the fall of my junior year, I discovered I was pregnant, and I knew the perfect picture was about to explode. I told my boyfriend, Marcus Rodriguez, first. We sat in his car in the school parking lot, the autumn sun streaming through the windshield. He held my hand. He told me he loved me. He promised we would handle it together. He said his family would support us. He was captain of the soccer team, honor roll, and his parents adored me. For a few precious days, his promises were the only things keeping me stable. I trusted him. I trusted in us. The hardest part was telling my parents. I waited until after dinner on a Sunday. My father was at his desk reviewing work papers. My mother was loading the dishwasher, her movements efficient and silent. The atmosphere was thick with the unspoken expectations of our family. Don't cause problems. Don't have needs. Don't be imperfect. I stood in the center of the living room, my hands clenched at my sides. Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something. My father looked up from his papers, his expression mildly annoyed, as if I were an interruption to important business. What is it, Sarah? My mother paused in her cleaning, a dish towel in her hands. Is this about your SAT prep? You know those scores are crucial. No, I said, my voice barely audible. It's something else. I took a shaky breath. The words felt like razors in my throat. I'm pregnant. Silence. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was a void. It drained all warmth, all oxygen, all hope from the room. My father slowly set down his papers and removed his reading glasses. He folded them with deliberate precision. My mother remained frozen, the dish towel clutched in her white-knuckled hands. My father spoke first. His voice was low, measured, and colder than any winter storm. What did you just say? I'm pregnant, I repeated, louder this time. I searched his face desperately, looking for anything. A trace of concern, a hint of fatherly protection. I found nothing. His face was carved from stone. You are a disgrace, he said. The words weren't screamed. They were delivered like a medical diagnosis. A final verdict. You have brought shame on this family, on me. Tears began to blur my vision. I turned to my mother. She was my last hope. Mom. She finally moved, placing the dish towel on the counter with trembling hands. She wouldn't look at me. She stared at the floor, at the ceiling, at anything but her daughter. What did you expect, Sarah? She asked, her voice thin and brittle. What did you think would happen? All our friends, our community, what will we tell them? It was always about them, their image, their standing, their perfect facade. I was just a crack in the foundation. Marcus and I began, my voice shaking. We're going to figure it out. He said he'd help. My father laughed. It was a short, cruel sound. Marcus Rodriguez, do you understand what you've done? His family will abandon you. They will protect their son. And so will we. He stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to loom over everything. He walked to the front door and pulled it open. The cool evening air rushed in, a sharp contrast to the frozen atmosphere in the room. Get out, he said. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. What? You heard me. Get out of my house. You are no longer my daughter. My mother finally looked at me, her face pale and empty. There were no tears in her eyes. There was just hollow, cold resignation. Robert, maybe we should discuss. There is nothing to discuss, Linda, he snapped, his voice finally rising. She made her choice. She can live with the consequences. I will not have a slut living under my roof. The word hit me like a physical blow. I recoiled, my entire body flinching. I looked from his face to hers, pleading for one of them to take it back, to say it was a mistake, to say anything that resembled love. They said nothing. My father walked over to me, grabbed my arm, and dragged me toward the door. His grip was like steel. Go on, get out. He pushed me onto the porch. I stumbled, catching myself on the railing. I had nothing. No purse, no phone, no jacket, just the clothes on my back. The front door remained open. I could see the hallway, the stairs leading up to my bedroom, to my entire existence. My father walked to the bookshelf. He picked up the family portrait from my last birthday. Me, him, my mother, all of us smiling in matching outfits. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned it face down so that my smiling face was pressed against the dark wood of the shelf. Then he returned to the door and slammed it shut. The sound of the deadbolt was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of my life ending. I stood on the porch for what felt like hours. I don't know how long. Time had stopped having meaning. The sky grew darker. The streetlights flickered to life. I could hear the faint sound of a television from inside the house. My house. My former house. I was 16 years old. I was pregnant, and I had just been erased. The first person I tried to reach was Marcus. I walked for miles. My mind was a blank fog of shock. The familiar suburban streets of my neighborhood looked foreign and threatening. Every lit window was a reminder of a home I no longer had. I finally found a payphone outside a gas station. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial the number I knew by heart. It rang once, then went to an automated voice. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. No longer in service? I tried again. Same message. Cold panic began to slice through the numbness. He wouldn't do this. He promised. We were in this together. I used my last quarters to call his house. His mother answered. Her voice, which had always been so warm and welcoming to me, was now laced with ice. "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's Sarah. I know who this is," she said coldly. "Marcus is not available. Can you just tell him I called? It's urgent. I need to speak with him." "Listen to me, young lady," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My son has a bright future ahead of him. College, medical school. We will not let a mistake like you destroy that. Do not call this house again." The line went dead. I stood there, the receiver pressed against my ear, listening to the dial tone. That was it. His parents had intervened. They had cut me off just as efficiently as my own had. I was abandoned again, but I still had a tiny, desperate flicker of hope. Maybe Marcus didn't know. Maybe his parents had hidden his phone, forbidden him from contacting me. If I could just see him, talk to him, he would make this right. He had to. His house was in a gated community across town. It took me most of the night to walk there. The sun was rising as I reached the imposing iron gates. I told the security guard I was there to see Marcus Rodriguez. He made a call, then looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "The Rodriguez family has instructed me not to allow you on the property. They said if you don't leave immediately, they will call the police for trespassing." I was standing on a perfectly manicured strip of grass outside a fortress of wealth and privilege. I was 16, pregnant, homeless, and now I was a criminal. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Instead, I just turned and walked away. The next few weeks dissolved into a single continuous nightmare of survival. I learned about hunger. It wasn't just an empty stomach. It was a constant, gnawing ache that made it impossible to concentrate. I learned about shame. It was in the eyes of people who looked away as I tried to sleep on a bus bench, in the way a restaurant manager watched me as I lingered by the menu board, hoping for kindness. I learned about fear. It was the sound of footsteps behind me in the dark, the constant terror of having nowhere safe to go. Phoenix, the city I had always called home, had become a hostile wasteland. The parks, the libraries, the 24-hour coffee shops, they were all temporary refuges where I could try to disappear for a few hours. I learned to wash my face in public restrooms and to make a single muffin last for an entire day just to be allowed to sit in a warm booth. My pregnancy was a secret I protected fiercely, slouching to hide the small curve of my stomach. It was both a source of terror and my only connection to another human being. This tiny unborn life was the only reason I kept fighting. I had to survive for it. The final betrayal came about 6 weeks after I was kicked out. I was using the computer at a public library to search for resources when I saw an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was from a law firm. Attached was a formal letter on expensive letterhead from attorneys representing the Rodriguez family. The language was cold and legal. It denied all paternity claims. It called my accusations unsubstantiated and defamatory. It offered a one-time payment of $3,000 in exchange for me signing a document that would release all future claims and legally prohibit me from ever contacting Marcus or his family again. It was a settlement, a payoff, the price of my silence. I sat there in the quiet library staring at the screen. The polite, Professional words were more brutal than my father's shouting. This was Marcus's answer. This was his promise. It wasn't just his parents. It was him. He had chosen his comfortable future over me, over our child. He had signed off on my destruction. That was the moment something inside me hardened. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger grew alongside it. Resolve. I was not a problem to be solved with money. I was not ashamed to be hidden. I was a person and I would survive. I closed the email without responding. I would not take their money. I would not sign their papers. I would not give them the satisfaction of buying my silence. They had stolen everything from me, my home, my love, my future. But they could not take my dignity. They could not take my will. As I walked out of the library into the harsh sunlight, I was no longer just a scared pregnant girl. I was a survivor, and I was completely, utterly alone. That loneliness, I realized, was a strange kind of freedom. There was no one left to disappoint. There was no one left to betray me. There was only me and the battle ahead. The bus station had become my shelter. It was noisy, smelly, and unforgiving, but it stayed open all night. I could sit in the hard plastic chairs and pretend I was waiting for a departure. Some nights I would stare at the destination board, imagining buying a ticket to somewhere far away, but I had no money and nowhere to go. One morning, I woke up to the sight of a pair of sensible, well-worn sneakers standing in front of me. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. My first instinct was always fear. I expected security telling me to move along. Instead, I saw a woman. She was probably in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail and a face lined with both kindness and determination. She was holding 2 coffee cups. "You look like you could use some caffeine," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact without a trace of pity. Pity was something I had come to despise. It made me feel like a charity case. I stared at her suspiciously. "I don't have any money." "I didn't ask for any," she replied, extending one of the cups. "There's also a breakfast sandwich in this bag. Egg and cheese." My stomach betrayed me with a loud rumble. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I took the cup. The warmth spread through my cold fingers. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She sat down in the chair next to me, sipping from her own cup. "Because I used to run a youth shelter about 10 blocks from here. You learn to recognize kids who are running from something and kids who have nowhere left to run. You look like the second kind." Her name was Patricia Gonzalez. She was a retired social worker. She had spent 40 years working with at-risk youth before stepping down to care for her aging mother. But retirement, she explained, didn't suit her. She missed the purpose. She missed helping. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our coffee. She didn't ask me questions. She didn't ask my name, my age, or how I ended up sleeping in a bus station. She just let me exist. For the first time in months, I felt human again, not just a problem. When we finished, she stood up. "I still volunteer at a transitional housing program for young mothers. There's a bed available if you're interested. It's not permanent, but it's safe and clean. In exchange, you'd help with some administrative work. Filing, answering phones, basic stuff." It wasn't charity. It was an opportunity, a job. It was dignity. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me yet," she said, her expression softening slightly. "The program has rules, and some of the other residents can be difficult. But if you're willing to work, we're willing to help." That was the beginning. The room she offered me was small and basic, but it was clean, safe, and private. It had a door with a lock. The first night, I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, washing away months of grime and desperation. I slept for 14 hours straight in a real bed with real sheets. It felt like paradise. Patricia was true to her word. The work was simple but steady. I spent my days organizing files and answering phones at the youth center. But more importantly, she became my teacher. She taught me about resilience. As we worked together, she shared stories of other young women who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to thrive. "Trauma is like a fire," she told me one afternoon as we sorted intake forms. "You can let it burn everything down, or you can use it to forge yourself into something stronger. They gave you a gift, Sarah, even if they didn't mean to. They showed you that the only person you can truly depend on is yourself. That's a hard lesson, but it's the most valuable one you'll ever learn." She became my mentor. She was the mother I should have had. She wasn't gentle or sentimental. She was tough, practical, and incredibly wise. She taught me about responsibility. As we worked with other residents, she explained budgeting, goal setting, and the importance of education. She told me stories of women who had started with nothing and built successful lives through determination and planning. Independence isn't about having money, Sarah, she told me one evening. It's about having choices. Education gives you choices. Skills give you choices. The goal is to build a life where no one can ever take your choices away from you again. She taught me how to use my pain as motivation. Every time I felt overwhelmed by anger or sadness, she would give me a new project, a new challenge. Don't just sit there feeling sorry for yourself, she'd say. Channel that energy. Build something. Under her guidance, the broken, desperate girl who had been sleeping in bus stations began to transform. Someone new was emerging. Someone stronger. Someone who understood that while the world could be cruel and unforgiving, survival was a choice. Patricia didn't just give me shelter. She gave me a roadmap for rebuilding my life. And she was the first person to believe I had the strength to follow it. The first step in my reconstruction was my education. With Patricia's encouragement, I enrolled in a program to complete my GED. I studied in the small room every night after working at the center. The soft hum of the city outside my window was a constant reminder of the world I was determined to conquer. Algebra, which I had once found challenging, now seemed straightforward. It was a universe of logic and order, a welcome escape from the chaotic emotions of my recent past. I passed the exam with honors. Patricia celebrated by taking me to a nice restaurant. It was the first time I had been in a proper dining room since my parents had thrown me out. "This is your foundation," she said, raising her glass of lemonade. "Every achievement from now on is a stone in the wall you're building around yourself. Make it tall and make it strong." After my GED, I started working full-time at the youth center. Patricia helped me get promoted to intake coordinator. I learned how to interview struggling teenagers, how to assess their needs, and how to spot deception from across the room. The center was a laboratory of human behavior, and I became a scholar of survival. Patricia managed my finances with an iron fist. A portion of every paycheck went into a savings account she helped me establish. "This is your freedom fund," she called it. When it was substantial enough, she helped me make my first investment, a small certificate of deposit at the local bank. It was terrifying to write that check, but Patricia was confident. "You're not just saving money, Sarah. You're buying security. You're buying a piece of independence that no one can take away from you." As my savings grew, so did my ambitions. I enrolled in night classes in business administration at the community college. It was there, in a statistics class, that I met David Kim. He was a few years older than me, an accounting major working part-time at a CPA firm. He was quiet, methodical, and incredibly smart. We became study partners and friends. He understood numbers not just as figures, but as tools of protection and growth. One evening, I told him my story, all of it. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he simply said, "They left you with nothing. That was their mistake. It means you have nothing to lose and everything to gain." David became the architect of my financial fortress. After he graduated and got his CPA license, he was the first person I hired. He helped me establish my first LLC, a consulting company to manage my growing investments. He created budgets that were bulletproof. He taught me about taxes, retirement planning, and the power of compound interest. "We will document everything," he said. "We will build a financial foundation so solid that no storm can shake it." He was methodical, careful, and absolutely loyal. He was the second cornerstone of my new life. The world was evolving rapidly. It was the early 2000s, and the internet was transforming everything. Patricia, with her old-school social work background, was cautious. But I saw something else. I saw a new landscape being created, one without the traditional barriers that had held people like me back. It was a world where intelligence and determination could create success from nothing. Through an online entrepreneurship forum, I met Jennifer Walsh. She was a brilliant web developer, a shy but visionary young woman who could see the future in code. She was working on a new type of customer relationship management software. Most investors didn't understand it. They thought it was too specialized. But I understood the need for organization. I understood the desire to control your environment. I invested everything I had saved in her startup. It was the biggest risk of my life. Patricia thought I was reckless. David prepared the contracts with obvious concern. But I trusted Jennifer and I trusted my instincts. Jennifer became the third cornerstone of my foundation. With my funding and business guidance, her company flourished. The CRM software became an industry leader. The returns were extraordinary. I wasn't just financially secure anymore. I was wealthy, but it was never just about money. It was about what money represented: safety, autonomy, and control. With David managing the financial side and Jennifer guiding my technology investments, I built my empire. Every asset was protected by layers of legal structures. Every transaction was recorded. Every potential threat was analyzed. I moved from the transitional housing into a condo I purchased myself. It was modern, secure, and private. It was a home, but it was also a command center. Years passed. I was no longer a victim. I was the CEO of my own existence. My past was not a source of shame, but a case study in resilience. My parents and Marcus were cautionary tales, examples of what happened when you underestimated someone. I never forgot the lessons they taught me: betrayal, abandonment, erasure. I had used those lessons to build my armor, and I was ready for the war I knew would eventually come. For years, my life was a fortress. It was constructed of work, investments, legal safeguards, and the quiet, steady friendship of David and Jennifer. I was safe. I was successful. I was in control. But my fortress was also hollow. It was a home with no one to share it with. The silence that I had once treasured as sanctuary began to feel like solitary confinement. I was 31 when I realized I was pregnant again. It was unplanned, the result of a brief relationship with a colleague that had ended amicably months earlier. But this time, I wasn't a terrified 16-year-old. I was an established businesswoman. I had resources. I had a home. This time I could do it right. The news settled into my heart, not as a crisis, but as a quiet, growing joy. This was an opportunity to create a family on my own terms, to give a child the unconditional love I had never known. Patricia had passed away 3 years earlier, a peaceful end to a powerful life. I missed her wisdom more than ever. I would sit in my quiet condo and speak to her as if she were there, asking her what to do. I knew what she would say: stop overthinking and start planning. Build something beautiful. So I began to prepare a nursery. I painted the walls a soft lavender. I assembled a crib. I read books on parenting. For the first time since I was a teenager, I allowed myself to feel hopeful, to dream of a future that wasn't about protection, but about love. Then, at 6 months, I lost the baby. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. There was a sudden, sharp pain and then a devastating stillness. I was alone. I drove myself to the hospital, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind strangely clear. The doctors were compassionate. They used gentle words like miscarriage and unfortunately common. They assured me it wasn't my fault. But as I lay in the sterile white room, a profound and overwhelming grief consumed me. It was grief for the child I would never hold. But it was also grief for the 16-year-old girl who had been so full of terror and hope. Twice now, a child had been taken from me. The first time by cruelty, the second time by fate. I felt cursed, as if the universe was confirming the judgment my parents had delivered years ago. I was not meant to be a mother. I didn't cry in the hospital. I didn't cry on the drive home. I walked into the lavender nursery, closed the door, and sat on the floor. And then I broke apart. All the pain I had buried for more than a decade, the rejection, the abandonment, the loneliness, came flooding out. I mourned the daughter I had just lost. And I mourned the child I had been, the one who was forced to become a warrior when all she wanted was love. I stayed in that room for 4 days. David and Jennifer called, but I didn't answer. On the 4th day, I stood up. I looked at the empty crib, and I heard Patricia's voice in my head as clearly as if she were standing beside me. Trauma is like a fire. You can let it burn everything down, or you can use it to forge yourself into something stronger. My grief was a fire. My loss was a fire. I could let it reduce my dreams to ash, or I could use it. I emerged from that room with a new determination. Fate would not dictate my future. My parents would not have the final word on my life. I would be a mother. I would create my family. I would do it my way. The adoption process was long and invasive. It required me to open my life to examination, to answer questions about my past. But I was not ashamed. My past was proof of my resilience. 3 years later, I flew to a small city in Colorado. I walked into a social services office, and a caseworker placed a beautiful 18-month-old girl into my arms. She had dark curls and bright, curious eyes. She looked at me and her tiny hand reached for my face. In that moment, the walls around my heart crumbled. This was my daughter. I named her Emma Chun. I gave her my surname, the name I had carried through shame and into victory. I was reclaiming it. It was no longer the name of the man who had disowned me. It was the name of Emma's mother. It was our name. Raising Emma was the greatest joy of my life. She filled my quiet condo with laughter and energy. She was a brilliant, curious child. She was fascinated by how things worked, by why people behaved the way they did. Jennifer, my friend and business partner, became her unofficial aunt. She recognized Emma's spark immediately. She gave her first tablet, taught her basic coding when she was 7. I gave her the childhood I never had, a childhood of safety, encouragement, and unconditional love. There were no impossible standards she had to meet other than to be kind and to pursue her interests. Her passion was debate and public speaking. By the time she was 15, she was already winning state competitions. She wasn't just my daughter. She was my legacy. A legacy of choice, not biology. A legacy built from a decision I had made, not an accident of genetics. Her success was my success. It was the beautiful, flourishing life I had created from the ruins of my past. But I was a strategist. I had learned from Patricia and David that every strength can also be a weakness. Emma's talents made her visible. It made her a target. And I knew that somewhere in the darkness, the ghosts of my past were watching, waiting for an opportunity. Her success, I feared, would become the perfect lure for their greed. The first warning sign came in the form of a newspaper article. It was a feature in the local paper about outstanding high school students. There was a photograph of Emma, now 16, holding her state debate championship trophy. The article praised her intelligence, her poise, and mentioned her supportive single mother, Sarah Chun, a successful business consultant. I was proud, but a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. The article made us visible. It put our names, the Chun name, into the public sphere. For 22 years, I had lived a carefully private life. Now, a spotlight was shining on us. 10 days later, the first letter arrived. It was addressed to Emma, but delivered to my office. The return address was from my childhood neighborhood. The handwriting on the envelope was my mother's. David was in my office when the mail came. I stared at the letter on my desk as if it were an explosive device. "They found us," I said. "We knew they would eventually," he replied, his voice steady. "What's the strategy?" "The strategy is the same as it's always been," I said. "We are a fortress. We do not engage." I threw the letter in the shredder, unopened, but they were relentless. A week later, an expensive flower arrangement was delivered to our home. It was elaborate and gaudy, with a card addressed to our precious granddaughter, Emma. The card was signed, "With all our love, your grandparents, Robert and Linda Chun." Emma was puzzled. "I thought your parents died when you were young." I had told her a version of the truth about my past when she was old enough to understand. She knew I had been abandoned, but I had protected her from the cruelest details. She knew them as distant, abstract figures of cruelty, not as real people who might appear in our lives. "They are dead to us, sweetheart," I said, taking the card from her hand and feeding it into the paper shredder. "These are just two strangers who happen to share some DNA with me. They are not your grandparents." They didn't give up. They sent more letters, more flowers. They began leaving messages on my business voicemail, their voices thick with manufactured emotion. "Sarah, please," my mother's voice begged. "We've made terrible mistakes. We just want to know our granddaughter. We just want to be a family again." Then came the emails, not just to me, but to the general contact form on my company website. And then the social media campaign began. My mother created an Instagram account. She posted old photos of me as a child, accompanied by long, manipulative captions about her heartbreak and her desperate search for her lost daughter and the granddaughter she had never been allowed to meet. She was building a public narrative, painting herself as a victim. The final piece of the nightmare materialized 6 weeks later. I received an email from an address I hadn't seen in 22 years, Marcus Rodriguez. The email was pathetic. He wrote about his failed marriage, his struggling business, the fact that his wealthy parents had disowned him after a series of poor financial decisions. He said he had made a horrible mistake all those years ago. He said he thought about me and our child every day. He wanted to see me. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to be part of our lives. I didn't respond. A week later, David's legal team discovered that Marcus had been in contact with my parents. They had formed an alliance. Their plan became transparent. They weren't just trying to guilt me anymore. They were preparing for a legal assault. The official document came from their attorney. It was a formal petition for grandparent rights. They were suing me for court-ordered visitation, claiming I was maliciously alienating them from their only grandchild. The petition was filled with lies, portraying me as a bitter, vengeful woman who was denying a loving family their rightful place in a young girl's life. The lawsuit was their declaration of war. They had seen the article about Emma. They had seen the success attached to her name. They didn't want a granddaughter. They wanted a lottery ticket. They had discarded me when I was a liability. Now that I was an asset, they wanted to claim their share. I sat in David's office, the attorney's letter on the table between us. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even angry. I felt profound, ice-cold clarity. The moment I had been preparing for my entire adult life had finally arrived. They think this is a battle about family, I said to David. They think they can use emotion and public sympathy to win. What is it really about? He asked. I looked out the window at the Phoenix skyline, a city I now owned a piece of. It's a business transaction, I said, and they have no idea how thoroughly I'm about to destroy them. My parents and Marcus made a fatal error. They thought they were fighting the 16-year-old girl they had thrown away. They had no understanding of the woman I had become. They fought with sloppy emotion and public manipulation. I fought with precision, technology, and overwhelming evidence. The lawsuit was filed, and the game commenced. As part of the legal process, they had to communicate with me through official channels. David established a special email system and phone line, all of which were monitored and archived. It was a digital snare, and they walked directly into it. My mother would leave long, tearful voicemails performing her anguish for the court record. I just want to hug my granddaughter, she'd sob. Why are you doing this to your own mother? An hour later, Jennifer's team would intercept an email from that same mother to her sister, bragging that their lawyer said they had an easy case and that they would soon be financially comfortable. My father was more aggressive. He sent threatening emails disguised as paternal concern. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah. You need to think about what's best for the girl. A girl needs grandparents. We cross-referenced the timestamp of that email with a public post on a retirement forum where he was boasting to strangers about his genius granddaughter and how the family was about to benefit significantly from her talents. Marcus was the most careless. He was desperate. He sent emails directly to me, bypassing the attorneys. He pleaded. He threatened. He tried to blackmail me with our history. In one particularly foolish email, he outlined a settlement proposal. If I gave him a stake in my consulting business, he would testify that my parents were unfit and I would win the case. He was trying to play all sides. He didn't realize he was just creating evidence of his own conspiracy to commit fraud. We collected everything. Every email, every voicemail, every social media post, every financial document we could legally access. Jennifer and her team constructed a timeline, a digital web of their greed and deception. It was unshakable. It was devastating. And we kept it all secret. We let them believe they were winning. We let them construct their case of lies, unaware that we were building a mountain of truth to bury them with. The climax was the Arizona Youth Achievement Awards. Emma was receiving the Outstanding Student Leader Award. It was the biggest moment of her high school career. She was scheduled to give an acceptance speech to the most influential people in education and business. I knew my parents and Marcus would be there. They had obtained tickets through a mutual acquaintance. Their plan was to confront us publicly, to create a scene, to paint themselves as the loving grandparents being denied the chance to see their granddaughter succeed. I had a different plan. The auditorium was packed. Emma was backstage reviewing her speech. I was in the technical booth with a sound engineer. As the ceremony host walked on stage to introduce the award recipients, he paused. Before we honor these remarkable young people, he said, we have a special tribute to the unsung heroes who make achievement possible. The mentors, the supporters, the ones who believe in potential before anyone else sees it. The lights in the auditorium dimmed. The large screens on either side of the stage illuminated. It began with photos of famous achievers with their mentors. Then, a picture of young Jennifer Walsh appeared on the screen, followed by a photo of me. Finally, a picture of Patricia Gonzalez, smiling and strong. And then her voice filled the room. It was from an old recording I had made during a training session she had conducted years ago. Family. Her voice echoed through the massive speakers, clear and powerful. People misunderstand that word. They think it's about genetics. It's not. DNA is just biology. Family is who stands with you when you have nothing. Family is who builds you up, not who tears you down. Family is a choice. It's the people you choose to build your life with and the people who choose to build with you. As she spoke, a slideshow of photos played on the screen. Me and Patricia in the youth center. Me and David in his first office. Me and Jennifer at her startup launch. And then photo after photo of me and Emma. Reading to her as a toddler, helping her with a school project, cheering at her first debate tournament, hugging her, laughing with her. I scanned the audience and found them. My father, my mother, and Marcus sitting together near the back. Their faces were frozen in shock. They had come expecting a confrontation. They had come to make a scene. Instead, they were forced to sit in a dark, silent room and listen to a ghost define the one thing they had never understood. The video ended with Patricia's final words. You don't get to abandon people and then claim them when they become successful. Family is not a stock you can trade when it's profitable. It's a bond, and it has to be earned. The screen went black. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the room erupted in applause. They thought it was just an inspiring tribute. But I knew it was the opening shot in the final battle. The trap had been set. Now it was time to spring it. The morning after the awards ceremony, we held a press conference. We didn't choose a fancy hotel or a corporate conference room. We held it on the steps of the Patricia Gonzalez Youth Center, the first project my foundation had ever funded. The symbolism was intentional. The media was in a frenzy. The emotional tribute at the ceremony, followed by news of a lawsuit from estranged grandparents, had created a story they couldn't ignore. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. I stood at the podium with David on one side and Emma on the other. Emma had insisted on being there. I'm not a child, Mom, she had said the night before. This is my life too. I want to stand with you. David stepped up to the microphone first. He was calm, professional, and systematic. Good morning. We are here today to address the civil lawsuit filed against my client, Ms. Sarah Chun, by Mr. Robert Chun, Ms. Linda Chun, and their associate, Mr. Marcus Rodriguez. They are seeking grandparental visitation rights based on their biological relationship to Ms. Chun. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Their claim is based on a lie, and we have the evidence to prove it. On a large digital screen set up behind us, a document appeared. It was a legal agreement dated 22 years ago. This is a document signed by Mr. and Mrs. Chun as part of a confidential settlement with the Rodriguez family at that time. In it, they formally and legally renounced any and all parental rights, responsibilities, and future claims regarding Miss Chun and her unborn child. They did this voluntarily. They did this to protect their social reputation. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The document, with their signatures clearly visible, was irrefutable. Their entire legal case had just evaporated. But David wasn't finished. Their motivations for this lawsuit are not about family. They are about money. The screen changed. It now displayed a series of emails. The first was from Marcus Rodriguez to my father. It read, "Once we get the settlement, my share is 30%. We need to present a united front." The next screen showed my mother's Instagram posts, the ones filled with heartbroken pleas for her dear granddaughter, next to screenshots of her private messages to friends. One read, "Our lawyer says we can get a substantial settlement. Emma is worth a fortune." The evidence was overwhelming. The trap had not just closed. It had obliterated them. David laid out the entire conspiracy, email by email, voicemail by voicemail. He exposed their greed, their lies, and their pathetic attempts at manipulation. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. The reporters were speechless, frantically scribbling notes. Then I stepped up to the microphone. I looked directly into the cameras. I knew they were watching. My voice was not angry. It was not emotional. It was the calm, steady voice of a woman who was simply stating facts. For 22 years, I began, I have lived with the choice my parents made. They chose their reputation over their daughter. They threw me out of their home when I was 16 and pregnant because I was, in their words, a disgrace. They erased me from their lives. I paused. I accepted their choice. I built a new life, a better life. I found a new family, one built on love and loyalty, not biology. and I was blessed to become a mother. I put my arm around Emma, who stood tall and proud beside me. The lawsuit filed by Robert and Linda Chun is based on the claim that they are the biological grandparents of my daughter. This is the final lie I am here to correct today. I took a deep breath. This was the final blow, the truth I had protected so carefully for 16 years. My daughter, Emma Chun, is the greatest gift of my life. I love her more than words can express, and she is my daughter in every way that matters. But she is not my daughter by birth. The confusion on the reporters' faces was visible. Emma is adopted, I said, my voice ringing with clarity. She shares no DNA with me, and she shares no DNA with the people suing me for grandparent rights. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a truth so complete, so devastating that it left no room for argument. Their entire case, legal, moral, and public, was not just lost. It was fraudulent. They are not her grandparents, I concluded, looking straight into the camera lens, speaking directly to them. They are strangers, not her blood, not her family. They have no claim here. This ends today. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic for them. The press conference was a public execution. The story of the greedy fake grandparents who had tried to sue their abandoned daughter for access to her adopted child went viral. My parents became villains in a story they could no longer control. Their perfect, respectable lives crumbled to dust. The community they had cared so much about turned against them. Their friends stopped calling. Their country club revoked their membership. My father's small accounting practice lost all its clients overnight. They were forced to sell their house, the house they had thrown me out of, to pay their legal fees. I read in the local newspaper that they had moved to a small town in Nevada, disappearing into quiet, shame-filled obscurity. They had finally achieved what they had done to me 22 years ago. They had been erased. Marcus Rodriguez faced even worse consequences. The evidence of his attempt to orchestrate a fraudulent settlement was turned over to the district attorney. He was charged with conspiracy and extortion. His desperate grab for my wealth ended with him facing criminal charges. I felt nothing watching them fall. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a quiet, final sense of closure. They were no longer characters in my story. They were just a footnote in the prologue. My story was about what came next. With the lawsuit resolved, a profound peace settled over my life. The fortress I had built no longer felt like a defensive structure. It felt like a home. Emma and I grew even closer. The ordeal had been difficult for her, but she had seen firsthand the strength of the family we had built together. A family of choice, not of chance. She went off to college, not as the debate prodigy from the newspapers, but as a confident, compassionate young woman who knew she was loved unconditionally. I poured my energy into the Patricia Gonzalez Foundation. We expanded our mission, opening more youth centers and funding scholarships for teen mothers. I was becoming Patricia, using my resources to give other scared young girls the one thing they needed most: a chance, an unexpected ally. David was by my side through it all. Our friendship, forged in late-night study sessions and strengthened through legal battles, had deepened into something more. He was my partner in every sense of the word. He was quiet, steady, and he saw me for exactly who I was. He had witnessed my scars, and he had helped me transform them into strength. One evening, a year after the press conference, we were at the grand opening of a new transitional housing facility the foundation had built. It was a beautiful building filled with light and hope. As we stood watching a group of teenage mothers laughing and planning their futures, David took my hand. "Look what you built, Sarah," he said quietly. "From all that pain, you built this." I looked at him, at his kind eyes and the gentle smile that had been a constant in my life for 2 decades. I thought of the long, difficult road I had traveled, the betrayals, the loss, the struggle, and I realized it had all led me here, to this moment of peace and purpose. We built it, I corrected him, and right there, surrounded by the hopeful sounds of the future I was helping to create, I did something I had never planned. I proposed to him. I asked him to be my partner, my husband, my family. Officially. His answer was a simple, heartfelt yes. There was no grand, dramatic moment. It was quiet. It was certain. It was real. It was a choice. My life, once defined by the choices others had made for me, was now a testament to the power of my own decisions. I had reclaimed my name, my future, and the very definition of family. I had faced the ghosts of my past not with anger, but with truth. And in the end, I had found something far greater than victory. I had found peace.